In 1704, all of Europe was embroiled in the War of Spanish Succession. We discussed in our past video how Louis XIV's second grandson, Philippe, became the King of Spain after Carlos II of Spain died. A grand alliance against France was soon formed between England, the Dutch Republic, the Hapsburg monarchy, Brandenburg, Savoy, and Portugal. This alliance sought to nullify the Spanish succession to Felipe V. On the side supporting Philippe was France, along with Naples and Sicily, which were controlled by Spain, and Hungary and Bavaria, which were resisting the Habsburgs. At this time, Spain was in the grip of a civil war. Fierce battles were also being fought in Naples, Milan, and the Netherlands. Louis XIV had no intention of dragging out the war, so he decided to strike a decisive blow by penetrating the Holy Roman Empire and forcing the Habsburgs to surrender. So in May of 1704, he ordered his most trusted general, the Duke of Tallard, to direct France's main force to Vienna. He also had support of the Bavarian elector Maximilian II, who had switched sides to ally with France. Maximilian II was set to directly attack Vienna, and if his powerful Bavarian forces joined with Tallard's formidable French army, the Holy Roman Empire would be in grave danger. The Duke of Vendôme was also advancing toward Vienna from Lombardy in northern Italy. To make matters worse for Leopold, a rebellion broke out in Hungary, led by a nobleman named Rákóczi. He commanded a large rebel army moving towards Vienna from the east. Then, where were Austria's allies? England and the Netherlands were occupied with holding back massive French offensives in Flanders. Brandenburg was tied up in battles along the Rhine. Portugal and Savoy were fighting to seize Madrid from Spain. So, despite having many allies, Austria found itself facing the crisis in Vienna alone. Emperor Leopold I placed all his hopes on General Eugene of Savoy, but even Eugene recognized that he could not fend off both the French and Bavarian armies alone. Desperate for reinforcements, he sent a request for help to John Churchill, who was fighting on the Dutch front. John Churchill, 1st Duke of Marlborough, was the commander-in-chief of the English army. If his last name sounds familiar, that's no coincidence. That's the Churchill as in Winston Churchill, who was the British Prime Minister during the Second World War. Winston Churchill is a direct descendant of John Churchill. He became the commander-in-chief not long after the war began. England's William III, who was the commander of the anti-French alliance, suddenly died after a fall from his horse. His death at the age of 51 was a shocking and untimely blow. With the war already in full swing, his successor, Queen Anne, had to appoint a new commander-in-chief for England. The first person who came to mind was John Churchill, Duke of Marlborough. John Churchill had long been regarded as England's finest general, but his excessive pride, ambition, and opportunistic behavior had often led to distrust. William had always doubted him, despite Churchill's superior military capabilities. This mistrust had kept Churchill from gaining significant power or recognition. So Churchill had been deeply dissatisfied, to the point where he had even considered defecting to the exiled James II in France. But with William's death, these tensions disappeared, and Anne appointed Churchill as commander-in-chief to face Louis XIV. When Churchill received the request for help from Eugene, he was deeply troubled. It was clear that Austria needed immediate assistance. However, at the time, Churchill was engaged with the French in Flanders, defending the Netherlands. If he left to rescue Vienna, it would leave a huge gap in the northern front, and the Netherlands would almost certainly be taken. Given the situation in Flanders, he couldn't afford to move. But Churchill knew he had to go. If Vienna didn't receive any aid and fell, it would be a disaster. Emperor Leopold would have no choice but to cede vast territories to France. This would cause the alliance to collapse. The Netherlands would be in a precarious position, more vulnerable than before, and England would be isolated. So, if there was any chance of saving Vienna, the decision was clear. Churchill had to act quickly. But not everyone agreed with Churchill. For the Dutch, the northern front was their biggest immediate concern. If Churchill's English forces left the northern front publicly, it would have caused chaos in Netherlands, and France would have learned the situation immediately. So, Churchill secretly communicated his plan with only a few Dutch politicians, and then lied to the public. He claimed he was just repositioning his troops, and he marched his entire army south. He abandoned heavy equipment and reduced his artillery to increase speed. This was a gamble. If France had learned of his real movement and decided to push into Flanders, everything would have fallen apart. Churchill might have had to turn back north before even reaching Vienna. But Churchill believed that would not happen for two reasons. First, the French military was slow to adapt to the changing situations. In French military, all major decisions had to come from Louis XIV. Although Louis had brilliant military advisors who shaped the grand strategy, he required them to report and get his approval for all major decisions. And currently, the goal for the French forces in Flanders was to keep the Allied forces tied down. Changing strategy to invade the Netherlands wasn't something the field commanders could decide on their own. Churchill believed he had time to move south. Second, Louis XIV was in a rush to capture Vienna. Churchill figured that Louis's focus was entirely on Vienna, and he wouldn't divert strength to invade the Netherlands. Churchill's assessment was spot on. After Churchill's forces left for south, the French in Flanders were left confused, and eventually began pursuing Churchill's army instead of attacking the Netherlands. So, ironically, the Netherlands became safer after Churchill's forces left, enough so that the Dutch could send reinforcements to Vienna to help. Churchill was also a master of psychological warfare. While marching south, he spread rumors that his army was planning to attack Strasbourg and take Alsace. This forced the French to rush into Strasbourg, leaving them unprepared. By June 1704, Churchill's army reached the Danube River. In just 3 weeks, they had covered nearly 500 kilometers. Churchill's force had started with a little over 20,000 men, but by integrating various other units, it grew to nearly 40,000 by then. On June 10, 1704, a historic meeting took place in the village of Mondelsheim, just north of modern-day Stuttgart, Germany. General Eugene was waiting for him there. The two generals, both brilliant tacticians, recognized each other's abilities at once. At the time, General Churchill was 54 years old, and General Eugene was 40. Together, they analyzed the enemy's situation and considered their next moves. Despite Churchill's reinforcements, they were still outmatched. The French army, led by Tallard, and the Bavarian forces under Maximilian II, were larger and battle-hardened, while nearly half of Churchill's army consisted of newly joined troops. Still, the anti-French alliance had one advantage. Churchill and Eugene made a perfect team, each compensating for the other's weaknesses. Churchill was known for his command skills and his focus on the fundamentals. He earned a reputation for never giving up easily, always ensuring solid communication between units and maintaining an uninterrupted supply line. He also excelled at using reserves, so his army could maintain its strength even in prolonged battles. His leadership was flexible, adapting smoothly to changing circumstances. On the other hand, Eugene was famous for his aggressive tactics, leading fearless charges that struck terror in the hearts of his enemies. His troops, known for their bravery, would rush headlong into battle. If Churchill was the strategist, Eugene was the striker, going straight for the enemy's throat. Despite their contrasting styles, the two men created incredible synergy from the very start. The news of the English army joining forces with the Habsburgs spread quickly. In response, the Bavarian army joined the French. A major battle between the two sides was inevitable. The Habsburg forces aimed to intercept the French army on its way to Vienna, but the French and Bavarians had already seized several surrounding towns. The two armies finally met near the village of Blindheim along the Danube. Churchill and Eugene climbed the high steeple of a church to survey the enemy's position across the river. They observed that the terrain was cut by several tributaries flowing into the Danube River, with the village of Blindheim located just beyond the point where the Nebel River joined the Danube. The French and Bavarian forces were positioned on the plain between Blenheim and Lutzingen, across the Nebel River. After assessing the geography and enemy positions, they planned to lead their armies at dawn on August 13th. They estimated the enemy's strength at over 65,000 men, while their combined forces barely exceeded 50,000. Despite this, the two decided on a preemptive attack. The enemy was well entrenched, so attacking first was risky, but retreating would leave Vienna vulnerable, potentially leading to a complete collapse. Both commanders understood the risk of heavy casualties, but knew they had no choice but to attack. The commander of the combined French and Bavarian forces was the Duke of Tallard. He believed that Churchill and Eugene would be too intimidated to fight and would retreat. In his view, attacking was akin to throwing oneself against a brick wall. It's the kind of attack he himself would never attempt. He positioned himself with the French forces on the right. The Bavarians' forces were positioned on the left flank. Churchill saw that if those two armies combined their strength, victory would be impossible. He decided to take his forces to attack the French forces on the right. Eugene's forces were to take on the Bavarians to keep them busy, so that the Bavarians cannot send any reinforcement to Tallard. Churchill believed this would give him a chance to win that way. Eugene immediately understood the goal of this strategy, but also what it meant for his troops. It meant Eugene's men would bear the brunt of the casualties. Still, he agreed that this plan was the only viable solution. On August 13, 1704, at 2 a.m., Churchill and Eugene began their approach to close in on the Franco-Bavarian forces. At around 6 a.m., the vanguard of both armies clashed, and the first skirmish began. Dense fog blanketed the battlefield, making it difficult for either side to discern the other's exact location. The Duke of Tallard believed that Churchill's forces were moving north, and dispatched a significant portion of his cavalry across the river to pursue them. But when the fog lifted at 7 a.m., Tallard realized, to his shock, that the enemy was only half a mile away on the opposite side of the Nebel River. He urgently signaled the recall of his cavalry and artillery. Meanwhile, Churchill's engineers swiftly repaired a stone bridge over the Nebel, which the French had previously destroyed, and constructed 5 temporary bridges to facilitate the crossing of his troops. As the armies faced each other, the battle began in earnest with the cannons from both sides firing. Upon receiving the report that Eugene had effectively pinned down the Bavarian forces, Churchill ordered his troops to advance. The French forces quickly established a solid defensive formation, and caused heavy casualties among the advancing English troops. Nevertheless, Churchill's experiences came through. He pulled back his troops temporarily, then ordered the reserve forces to charge again. This tactic was like waves crashing in one after another. At the same time, Churchill anticipated he would need more cavalry, and requested reinforcements from Eugene. Eugene was conflicted. He himself needed all his forces to counter the Bavarian forces. Nevertheless, Eugene knew that this battle is won only if Churchill's English forces beat French. Even if his own forces wins against the Bavarians, if Tallard's French forces beat the English, all is lost. So he sent part of his cavalry to Churchill, knowing that his own troops will suffer heavy casualties. In contrast, Maximilian of Bavaria couldn't send reinforcements to Tallard. That difference decided the outcome. With the cavalry reinforcements from Eugene, Churchill intensified his offensive. Tallard, in response, retreated into the village of Blenheim. The morale of Churchill's allied forces was high, and they focused their attacks on the disorganized enemy units. At this moment, Churchill ordered his reserved cavalry to charge, instructing them to sweep away the enemy infantry stationed in the center. This was the decisive blow. As Tallard's central line collapsed, the French defenses crumbled. Many French soldiers tried to escape by jumping into the river, but many drowned. Those who couldn't flee surrendered. Tallard himself was captured. For France, this was the most humiliating moment of the Battle of Blenheim. He remained in captivity for 7 years. Nearly 40,000 soldiers from the French and Bavarian forces were either killed or captured. On the other hand, the English army suffered only about 2,000 casualties. Eugene's cavalry, however, sustained over 10,000 casualties, showing just how fiercely they fought in their charge. Following this notable achievement, Queen Anne granted Churchill the royal manor of Woodstock in Oxfordshire, as well as funds for the construction of what would become his family's ancestral home, the Blindheim Palace. Louis XIV had never experienced such a defeat before. Of course, he did experience some setbacks during the Dutch Franco War and the 9 Years' War, but this time, it was different. At Blenheim, the French commander-in-chief was captured, and the main French army was decimated and taken prisoner. It was the moment when the myth of the invincible French army crumbled. Although this single battle didn't immediately bring down France, it nonetheless gave a clear sense to Europe that the age of French dominance is over. France continued to fight the invigorated anti-French coalition, but each time, the remarkable strategies of Churchill and Eugene thwarted them. As a result, the Habsburgs were able to secure their territories, suppress the Rákóczi-Hungarian rebellion, and regain control of Bavaria. Maximilian II had to live in exile for 10 years. So today, we have explored the Battle of Blenheim, which shaped the future of 18th century Europe, and the role Eugene of Savoy played in it. If Louis didn't deny Eugene's request to join the French army 20 years ago, would the outcome have been different? We will never know, but we will continue with the stories in our next video. So please like and subscribe to continue receiving the stories from history. It really helps a small channel like us.